Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, on the traditional lands of the Otomi people. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. We have a very special program for you today on this special day, July 26th. It's the anniversary of the start of the Cuban Revolution in 1953. And to mark the occasion, we are launching today where is it? We're launching today a campaign to raise funds for medical aid to Cuba. We are partnering with, I had a screen here to show you all. Okay. Here we are now. We're launching this campaign to raise funds to send medical aid, medicines, and syringes to Cuba. We're partnering with there we go. Global Health Partners, which has been sending syringes to Cuba. And in fact, Mark Ginsburg, our speaker today, has been working on that project. They have to date sent 6 million syringes and have raised like $500,000 for that. And I understand that the first shipment of syringes arrived in Cuba just this past weekend. So by donating to this campaign, you're able to further enhance that effort to send not only syringes, but also medicines. Although Cuba has a very quite sophisticated pharmaceutical industry, they don't produce all of the medicines they need and have had difficulty getting the materials needed to produce what they normally do. And so there is a serious shortage of medicines, and as well as syringes with which they can apply the vaccines that Cuba has developed. So you can help in this effort by contributing, and you can do so through our website, globaljusticecenter.org, and your funds will be greatly appreciated, and especially by our friends in Cuba. Our speakers today are well-versed in Cuban affairs. They are Al Campbell, who is professor emeritus at the University of Utah and an editor of the International Journal of Cuban Studies. He comes to us today from Switzerland. Our first speaker will be Mark Ginsburg, who's a visiting scholar in international educational policy at the University of Maryland. And he comes to us today from Santa Cruz, California. So we're spread all across the map today. Let me give the floor first to Mark. He'll speak for maybe 20 minutes, and then Al will have his turn. After that, we will have Q&A. Okay, Mark, take it away.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Cliff, for organizing this on, as you say, at a very important date in the history of Cuba. I'm going to share with you some of the findings from a paper that will be published in the near future, I guess later this year, in the International Journal of Cuban Studies, which, as you heard, Al is the editor. Let me go ahead and share my screen at this point and start my presentation. I am speaking to you, as Cliff mentioned, from a place that's now called Santa Cruz, California. Actually is part of the unceded territory of the Oahuas people. And it's really an amazing opportunity to speak to you on this date. I wish that more of my Cuban colleagues were able to attend, but they will be able to view the YouTube version recording of this. In addition to having kind of a distant relationship, having retired with the University of Maryland, and quite active in the Bay Area Saving Lives Committee, and it's through that my involvement with the syringe campaign. I noticed, by the way, that Bob Schwartz, who's the key person at the Global Health Partners, has joined us. So maybe at some point he'll comment on that part. As many of you know, Cuba has continued to revise over time its constitution, and that's what I want to talk about today. I will try to go beyond just indicating what the Constitution says to what evidence I have from other published literature of some of the dimensions of the Cuban experience. And I know Al is going to go into much more detail on the economic dimension. I think it's important to start out with the fact that a large percentage, but not the entire population, voted in February of 2019. And of those, a large majority, but again, not all of them. And if we're going to end up talking a little bit about the recent situation, this is some indication of the diversity. But I think it's important to say that in talking with some of my colleagues, either they or friends of theirs who voted against the Constitution in 2019 were concerned about one or more of the articles, not overall. But again, the huge turnout. And more importantly, and I'll come back to this issue of 21st century socialism and protagonist democracy, look at the extent to which there were participants in popular consultations leading up to the draft of the Constitution that was then reviewed by the National Assembly, eventually approved after some amendments, and then went into effect after the referendum. The Constitution is a, 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 sizable and impressive document. it partly reflects many changes that were suggested, both in terms of some of the articles and even some of the titles. Because of the press of time for today, I'm not going to talk in detail about all of the titles, focus mainly on the ones that you see highlighted in blue here. But it's really cross-referencing Constitution in the sense that citizenship, for example, is built up in the Article 6 of the structure of the national state. What I'm going to try to do, and I note that Michael Leibowitz is on, in addition to his work and that of Roger Burbach and others, but mainly I've drawn on Marta Harneker's work to think about 21st century socialism and to review what is represented by the Constitution as fitting in some ways and not in other ways what is laid out in her work in particular as major characteristics and elements of 21st century socialism. Obviously, the idea of her work and those of others I've mentioned is to draw on ideas that in particular Hugo Chavez and others have tried to put into practice in recent decades in Latin America. But to contrast it from the 20th century socialism, most often associated with the USSR, but also parts of Eastern Europe. But importantly, I think we should note that 21st century socialism actually has some connections to the notions of socialism promoted by Marx and Engels in the 19th century. And so in some ways, there are aspects that were, in my view, distorted during the 20th century. I'm only going to focus on a few of the several that I go into more detail in the article. Again, because of time, briefly discuss what each of these characteristics represent and show where the Cuban Constitution either seems to reflect that very clearly or where there are contradictions or tensions. And I would say even within the writings of the 21st century socialism, those tensions are sometimes emphasized. So the first one of promoting participatory or participative or protagonistic democracy, this is one that is very often emphasized, particularly in Harneker's work. And you can see within, Article 3 that, sovereignty resides in the people, and that the state derives all power from it. People exercise it directly through various assemblies of people's power. But in addition to that, and this is where I think Cuba has historically, but in more recent years, even more so, encouraged participation, particularly in mass social organizations. What has shifted in the last decade and what is signaled in the Constitution is much more the involvement of people in consultations, but also in local assemblies of people's power, and even sub-municipal assemblies of people's power. I just remind you that how many people participated in the constitutional reforms, in the debates about them, and the number of proposals that were made. But this is not something that has just happened, and is not something that some authors have emphasized is mostly attributable to the ascendancy to the presidency of Raul Castro. You can go back even to 1991, as I indicate on this slide, where there was very widespread participation in debates leading up to the Fourth Communist Party of Cuba Congress. But certainly with the changes that Raul and some of the leaders involved tried to promote, even more examples of extensive participation. So in some ways, this aspect is reflected in Cuba's constitution. It's a surprise to no one who's online that the Constitution would refer to Cuba as a socialist economy, ownership of the whole people. But I think much like some of the writings on 21st century socialism, there's a little bit of attention about the role of the state and of workers' self-management and planning. And that's reflected in the Constitution as well. Article 19, Article 19, for example, talks about the state directing, regulating, controlling economic activity. But it also, in Article 20, workers are seen as, in addition to mass organization and neighborhood people's councils, playing a major role in shaping some of the proposals and ideas for the plan. But the question about ownership of the means of production, I think you can go back to Marx and Engels, where the private sector does not totally disappear, but certainly within the notions of 21st century socialism, the existence of the private sector is not seen as a contradiction to being a socialist system. So in addition to ownership by socialist of being socialist and of all people, private enterprise is listed in the Constitution as one of the forms of ownership. But the primary one, the main one, it's emphasized in the Constitution, is socialist of all the people, ownership and the control over the means of production. This particular dimension of 21st century socialism, having a decentralized but aggregating planned economy, this is part of the big contrast from 20th century socialism, where the economy is seen to be planned primarily centrally, and certainly planning is not the shift. The question is, how decentralized is the participation in planning? In Cuba, Article 18, obviously emphasizes the planned nature of the economy, but in that article and in several others, the contribution of workers at the unit level, production level, as well as mass organizations and local people's power assemblies participate. But the tension I mentioned briefly before about the state directing, regulating, controlling while workers participate is, I think, a tension within not only Cuba's constitutional representation of its society, but also in 21st century socialism. And that's partly because of this parenthetical thing that I've inserted here about aggregation, that while you can have local participation and strong shaping of the economy and planning of the economy, there at some point needs to be some consideration of cross work units and cross geographical units of the economy, and building if you will, a national plan that recognizes the importance of local contributions and differences across locales. In addition to this, Harnacker emphasizes as part of this the focus on the environment and thinking about the economy not only as a place of production, but a place of human development. And the articles I reference here give quite strong emphasis to the importance of considering the environment in economic and other decisions, as well as considering the experience of humans, both in the employment, but also in the in consumption. This is an area probably that comes closest to much of the work that I do in international education policy, and it's of no surprise or new information to anybody about the strength of Cuba's education system. The Constitution makes quite clear again, as previous constitutions have, that that the state is responsible for education as well as science and culture, and that the state is responsible for establishing an educational system to which free access for all citizens is available, free from preschool through graduate level university. Obviously, not all Cubans get graduate degrees, but certainly no Cubans graduate from an undergraduate institution or get a master's or doctoral degree encumbered by huge debt. In fact, no debt except for if you will, a social debt to the society. But the education system is not just about building up skills that can be used in the economy or that can be used to foster political participation. They're very, very strong focus on as mentioned in the large middle paragraph, on the ideology and ethics inherent in our socialist society. And so while much of the efforts of the education system have been to develop the human resources of the Cuban society, at various times the whole question of what kind of a person should exist and what kinds of incentives should motivate people to work and to serve society. That has certainly been a struggle within the education system, and at various times there's been a strong effort to revise and reinforce aspects about promoting a non-individualistic collectivist orientation among the Cuban people. Let me just conclude by noting that some of the areas of the Constitution are very much in line with 21st century socialism. Some have argued, including Burbach and some of his colleagues, that Cuba is only an example of the 20th century socialism, or at least a quite different one. And I think it is different than Bolivia and Venezuela, or even the kind of ideal type characteristics that Harnacker and others discuss. But I think the Constitution at least reflects quite a bit of match with the notions of 21st century socialism. I realize, of course, that a constitution is a document, and it doesn't necessarily reflect everything about what's going on in society. But there's certainly enough description of some of the areas to suggest that the ideal signaled in the Constitution is to a great extent represented on a day-to-day basis in the lives of Cubans. I'm hoping we can discuss some of these issues of the Constitution in relation to more recent events in Cuba during the Q&A. Let me just end with a thank you to people who are attending, to Cliff and the Center for organizing this. And I highlight the photo on the right-hand side to reinforce Cliff's notes about the importance of supporting what is an incredibly successful healthcare system and international missions to provide healthcare around the world, but one that is definitely suffering at the moment from lack of basic ingredients, as well as medicines to provide. And as was noted, even up until recently, with the help of international solidarity, syringes to put shots in the arm of Cubans. Cubans are obviously a small minority of the world population, but have produced five vaccines against the COVID-19, two of which have reached a stage where they can be used because they've passed with flying colors the clinical 3 trials. Let me stop there. I look forward to your questions and our discussion.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark. And next we will turn the mic over to Al Campbell and take it away.
Okay, so let's see. You can hear me now. Let's see if we can get the screen right. I think we did this. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes. Can you enlarge it?
Yeah, enlarge it. That's right. Enlarge it and then switch it. Okay. You're sharing your screen? Why don't I have a button to switch this?
Go to slideshow on the top bar.
I know, slideshow on the bottom. Yeah, you're right. Top, bottom. Yeah. Okay. And then I switch it up here. Display settings. Okay, there we go. Okay, well, I want to just repeat Mark's thanking Cliff and the center for having this event. Mark already brought up a lot of interesting economic issues, but I'm actually not going to talk about them. I'm going to talk more about the history leading up to where Cuba is now as background. And then in the discussion, we'll return to issues that Mark brought up and other economic and social issues in Cuba. So I'm going to talk fairly rapidly, but I see that I know a lot of the people on the group, and they're all very high-level intellectuals. So provided I speak clearly, they should be able to follow me, maybe. I will start off right now with slide 1, the Cuban economy, 60 years trying to build socialism, and today, hopefully in 20 minutes. While everyone in the world knows that the economic situation in Cuba is bad and that the economic downturn has been even worse than in the majority of countries in the world who have also had downturns because of COVID, the question on the minds of most friends of Cuba and most supporters of their 60-year effort to build a non-capitalist economy is, first of all, how bad it is, and then of more importance, will it bring down the government and end the revolution? And of course, the same question with the opposite hopes are on the minds of all those who hope now and have long hoped for the return of capitalism to Cuba. The rumors on the economic situation flow out of Cuba on a daily basis, while actual statistics on its economic performance also come out, but only at a trickle. This talk will end by talking about today, and presumably that will be almost the entire focus of the half of the webinar that will be devoted to discussion. This talk, to the contrary, will mostly be about Cuba's economic performance over the last 60 years, especially over the last 30 years, and especially over the last 15 years up through 2019. All of this is necessary background that one has to have in order to understand, to even be able to meaningfully discuss or even meaningfully think about the economic turmoil going on in Cuba today. A structural note on the presentation, given the very appropriate time limitation to 20 minutes, so that we'll be able to have an hour available for discussion, I can only very briefly, I hope clearly, but in any case briefly, refer to a number of ideas one needs to think about at some length in thinking about the situation in Cuba. What I will do for a number of these, therefore, is reference two recent academic papers of mine where these ideas are discussed at greater length, so that anyone listening who wants to think about these issues at greater length can look there for some further discussion. Anyone listening to this talk can get these two papers from my easy-to-remember email addressed on this slide. My name is Al, and I'm an economist formerly at the University of Utah, and hence the address, or by asking Cliff, who has both the papers. Let me see if I push this. That advances, great. Slide 2. So the structure of this very short presentation will be in two parts. Almost the entire presentation will be part 1, which is on Cuba's 60-year economic performance up to 2019, with more weight on the more recent period. And the second part will be just a few observations on today, 20 and 2021, presented as an opening to the interactive discussion on that in the hour that will follow. The first part will itself be divided into 3 parts. Part A will be extremely brief, but is necessary, and was already indicated in the title. One cannot evaluate Cuba's economic performance for 60 years and today without knowing what its economic goal is. Cuba's economic goal has been not just material growth and not even just development, both of which are economic goals. To the contrary, as part of its clearly declared 3-dimensional social goal, it has a 3-dimensional economic goal to build a prosperous, sustainable, and socialist economy. Okay, so that's it for subpoint A on this slide. Subpoint B will look briefly at the first 30 years, and subpoint C will look at somewhat greater length at the next 30 years before, as mentioned, the talk will end very briefly, opening up the discussion on what everyone's talking about today, what's going on in Cuba today. Okay, point 1B, the section on Cuba's economic performance from 59 to 89 will be brief, since its purpose in this talk is only as background for understanding what's going on today. This section will have 3 parts. Part 1 is an overall evaluation and can be presented in 1 sentence, which I'll do right now. Cuba's overall economic performance from 1959 to 1989 was very strong, where the meaning again, is that of the measuring rod, again, is that of an average economy of a country in Cuba's economic region, Latin America. Note in passing that it never had the rates of growth that several Asian economies have had for extended periods of time. The second part of point 1b will be on the rate of growth of Cuba's gross domestic product, its GDP, over that period. And the third part will be looking at its economic performance through measures beyond the ubiquitous and far from satisfactory standard measure of economic performance, the rate of growth of GDP. Okay, subpoint 1b2, the GDP growth. So it'll be simple. I consider the evaluation by Zimbalist and Brudenius done in 1989 to be methodologically the best one done. They found Cuba's rate of growth of GDP from 1960 to the last year that they had data on when they did their conversions, 1985, to be 3.1%. And that was the second highest in Latin America, only behind Brazil, which was 3.4%. The source and page numbers for this estimate are included on this slide. Okay, subpoint A of 1.B3, the inadequacy. Despite the ubiquitous use of the country's level of gross domestic product to indicate the well-being of the country, the conceptual problems connected to doing that have long been very well known. So in 1990, the United Nations created a new measure for the well-being of a country, focused on how well a country seemed to be promoting human development, calling it the Human Development Index, or HDI, with the idea that chronic poor health and infirmity curtails a person's opportunity for human development. It considers life expectancy to be a first component of the index, viewed as a proxy for health that almost all countries have decent statistics on, with the idea that education is crucially important for numerous aspects of human development, such as the ability to learn about and from the world around us and the ability to take part in running one's own society. It considers a country's average level of education as the second component of the index. And finally, given that material wealth has the potential to promote human development, though it does not automatically do so, it considers the standard GDP measure as a third component, but again, here viewed not as a goal in itself, but rather as an indication of a country's promotion of human development. I present a more extended, though still short, discussion of the limits of GDP and the history and nature of HDI in a paper evaluating against a multidimensional economic goal, sustainable and prosperous socialism, that was just published in the International Journal of Cuban Studies last month. As of January this year, the International Journal of Cuban Studies went open access, so you can read this and its last 10 years of articles free online. But again, I will send anyone wanting them instructions for accessing it, or you can get those from Cliff. I will also reference the article again several times in the talk. A comparison of a country's international ranking by its per capita GDP against its international ranking by its HDI then indicates something about a country's commitment to use its material output to promote human development. The more a country's ranking by HDI is above its ranking by GDP, the more this indicates that the country is committed to using its material output to better human development, as opposed to, say, using it for the accumulation of capital. The first year the HDI came out, 1990, was the first year after this first period of the Cuban economy that we are looking at in this section. That report did not actually list the GDP figures that it used for each country, as the later ones did. So one cannot give an exact ordering of countries by GDP, but it did put all countries into one of three broad aggregates: low, middle, or high income. It listed Cuba as a middle income country. It did actually rank all the 130 countries in the first report of their HDI, and Cuba was 39th out of the 130 that were listed, with the report placing this in the high HDI aggregation. Cuba in this period distributed its limited middle income material resources towards human development, and through that achieved a relatively high HDI ranking, higher than its GDP ranking. There I will now, in subpoint B here, to really look at the economic performance, one needs to go beyond the aggregation of the many, many different aspects of economic well-being into a single index, and instead look at them all separately. This, of course, is a book-length project to do thoroughly, and I did this just briefly in 2016 in a paper on Cuba published in Socialism and Democracy. updating Cuba's economic model, socialism, human development, markets, and capitalism. Again, anyone wanting a copy of this paper can get it by contacting me or by contacting Cliff. In any case, there I look briefly at 8 dimensions of human well-being that economic development should promote. I, of course, cannot begin to go into the data I provided there, but I will here, I didn't do it in the paper, quickly indicate my qualitative evaluation based on the data there of Cuba's performance in these areas over 1959 to 1989, again, relative to an average Latin American country. And again, the point above all here is to see how these have changed in the next and current periods as part of understanding the situation in Cuba today. So I'm very aware, of course, that other people, and especially, but not only opponents of Cuban revolution, would contest the qualitative results that I will give. And that's why there's so much debate about Cuba and its economic performance. And there, of course, is no time in this opening presentation to present the large amount of data that one would necessarily have to consider to reach either these or any opposing qualitative conclusions. But again, for anyone interested in the simple and basic data that I feel I can base these conclusions on, please do read my article, which presents the data. Actually, Cuba, of course, changed tremendously in all the following dimensions from 59 to 89. So the qualitative evaluations that are being asserted here only refer to what they had achieved in the 1980s. Note that the ordering of these, which is sort of in line with the general idea of going from basic animal-like physical necessities to higher level economic needs to develop their specifically human potential humanity. So food, and I'm just going to go through these quickly. Food evaluated as very good. And for some people who went down there then and ate the imported Russian spam, they might disagree with that. But my point is evaluated by the United Nations in terms of calories, proteins, and fats consumed, they had a very good diet. Housing, surprise on this, and I give the data in there. I evaluate as good, not very good, but good, and I explain why that is. And of course, that's quite contrary to what one expects. Healthcare and education are both excellent. That's quite expected. GDP growth, I evaluate as strong, and I already talked about that from the Zimbalist Brindenius paper. Poverty and unemployment, excellent. They basically eliminated both of them in that period. And then the last two, social participation, I would call very good, and self-governance, significant and important and arguably expanded over the 30 years, but inadequate for its declared goal of building socialism. So in the discussion, if anyone wants, we can talk more on any of these, and in particular the last two, which many people would not think of as economic points, but which I consider to be essential economic points for building a post-capitalist economy as part of a post-capitalist society. So keeping in mind this clock and that this is the more distant background to today's situation, I'll now jump to part 1C, Cuba's economic performance in the next 30 years, 1990 to 2019, with this period being subsequent to the collapse of the larger economy that Cuba had developed as part of for 20 years, the USSR anchored Comecon. Okay, here we'll consider economic performance in the opposite order that we did in the last period, first considering the broader multidimensional issues and then looking at GDP growth. After that, we'll look at the structural limitations on Cuba's GDP growth that must be understood to understand and to intelligently discuss Cuba's economic problems today. So note that I put here for reference the qualitative evaluations from 59 to 89 period given before so that you can easily make a comparison to the thing right now. Going through these quickly, during 90 to 2019, we could call it generally very good. So that's down from good. That's very good, except for in the special period of the first half of the 1990s and right now when it's not so good. But again, evaluated not by total variety of options, but by the proteins consumed, the calories consumed, and the fats consumed. Housing, average, but definitely not average for Latin America, but definitely not adequate. And that's down from good in the period before. Healthcare, down to good. Education, down to good. And both of those had to do with limited ability, Cliff already referred to it, to inputs into those processes. GDP, was down to average performance, and we'll look at that in the next point in greater depth. Okay, so again, one can discuss each evaluation, and for that one will need to look at the data. Again, please see my paper for simple and basic supporting data for my evaluations. But the simple point that I want to make, and which is one important factor in the situation in Cuba today, not the only, is the direction of the change. Again, it's not true that the Cuban economy is now, or has it been for the last 30 years, a basket case. Far from it. It is true that not only now, but in some dimensions over the last 30 years, the Cuban economy has done less well relative to its measuring rod of Latin America than it was doing in the 1980s. And this is one very important factor in understanding the attitude of those, say, over 40 in Cuba today towards the situation in Cuba today. Okay, first, let's look at the final of the 8 considerations that weren't on the last slide. That we looked at in the 1980s. We see the same qualitative trend that we saw in the first 5, that they're not bad, but they are worse performance in some dimensions. Okay, the very important but that has to go with that, however, is that at the same time in those last 30 years, Cuba's made some impressive and important economic advances over where it was before 1990, and these must also be taken into account, particularly when thinking about what Cuba's options are for getting out of the serious difficulty that it's in now. First, point B here, even with the huge pressures of the economic collapse in the first half of the 1990s, Cuba maintained its commitment to using whatever resources it had for human development. After recovery to 1989 levels of output by the beginning of the noughts, going beyond that with strong growth during the world commodity boom of the mid-noughts, and then returning to normal growth after the Great Recession, by 2013, Cuba had improved its relative HDI ranking to 44 out of 187 countries. Okay, continuing on the topic of major improvements in this period of several important sectors of the economy, note that one of the best recent books on Cuba's political and economic development over the last 30 years, written from the perspective of supporting the declared goals of Cuba's socialist revolution, documenting a number of important successes or partial successes, and at the same time pointing out important limitations in what Cuba achieved, is the book We Are Cuba, How Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World by Helen Yaffe from 2020. Besides chapters that I expect a number of listeners to this talk would find very interesting, given her thoughts on the ideological issues of the battle of ideas and the theoretical and historical chapter on the combined political and economic topics of, respectively, the challenges of socialist economic development and Cuba's special period of the 1990s, 3 chapters give extensive data on 3 issues relevant to the focus issue of this talk on Cuba's economy and the issue of how to get out of its present difficulties. Cuba's internationally recognized biotech sector, its energy sector, and its medical internationalism based on its medical sector. She does not, and one should never, reduce consideration of these issues in Cuba to their narrow economic dimensions. But for this short and focused talk on the economy, we will consider these below only very briefly in their narrow economic dimensions in regard to Cuba exiting from its present situation. Okay, on to section 1C2, growth of the GDP in the 1990 to 2019 period. Here it will be easiest to grasp as well as most comprehensive if presented graphically. The red line here is Cuba, and a first striking result is the depth of the crisis 1990 to 1993, with the GDP falling about 37% in 3 years, about the same amount in the same amount of time as the US in the Great Recession in the US of the 1930s. But relative to our concern of qualitatively comparing it with the Latin American region, leaving aside that implosion at the beginning of the 1990s that resulted from the disruptive collapse of the larger economy that the Cuban economy was part of, a collapse which didn't affect the rest of Latin America. We're going to talk more on that collapse in just a minute. The Cuban economy did about average over the last 25 years. That's why I evaluated it that way in that other slide. It did not do noticeably better than Latin America during, it did do noticeably better than Latin America during the world commodity boom of the mid-noughts.
And most important for today, it did slightly better than the average for Latin America from 2015 until the effects of the increased Trump restrictions really began to affect the economy. But again, we see that unlike 1960 to 1985, when it was the second strongest performer in Latin America, it did about average. Again, a point to stress is that without denying that the many real economic problems that Cuban economy has, the frequently repeated assertion by opponents of the Cuban Revolution that the Cuban economy has always been a basket case is factually completely disproved by standard economic data. Now, so given that there's no indication that Cuba has reduced in any way its commitment to the use of what material resources it has access to for human development, exiting this economic crisis is actually focused on restoring the currently very problematic contraction of the GDP. Given that, I want to look very quickly at a fundamental structural issue for Cuba's production and growth using the data from this period before closing the talk by opening up the discussion on what Cuba needs to do to exit its current crisis. The fundamental point is that for any country to produce efficiently, what is necessary for a high material standard, which is necessary for a high material standard of living, some, though definitely not all, things need to be produced on a scale larger than the demand for that good in any small-sized country, and Cuba is a small country, or to a lesser extent, any medium-sized country, like, say, Germany or Vietnam. This is only not true for countries large enough to have continental economies like China, India, the US, and some other very large countries. And of course, even those do trade extensively for efficiency gains, especially if they are less developed. In addition, and related, most high-value goods are produced in value chains that have several to many steps that the goods being produced must pass through from one step to the next. To produce at an efficient scale, a small country needs to concentrate on one or two steps in a few value chains here and there. And so it needs to be able to buy the necessary inputs for and sell the outputs from its steps to steps that are conducted outside the country. Only a continental-sized economy can keep almost all the steps in all its value chains within its own economy if it chooses to. Take, for example, the 6 countries in Europe with the highest openness index, and that is the sum of their imports and exports divided by their GDP multiplied times 100. All of which have a sum of exports plus imports that is incredibly more than 1.5 times their GDP. So they have an index of over 150. 2 are the small, highly developed first world countries, Belgium at 165 and Netherlands at 155. And 4 are, please note this, it's relevant to Cuba, countries that came out of Comecon. Slovakia at 180, Estonia at 167, Lithuania at 163, and the Czech Republic at 160. So before noting what this means for Cuba's ability to get out of its economic problems and its economic future in general, let me jump back to indicate what this says about Cuba's past. Cuba did not implode in the 1990s because Soviet subsidies ended, no matter how often that sheer idiocy is repeated. Cuba imploded because what was just indicated. Any small country to develop to a higher standard of living must be integrated into a larger economy that it trades extensively with, like the 6 mentioned European countries, into the EU and into the larger world capitalist economy. Cuba could not have developed as it did up to 1989 unless it was integrated into a larger economy through trade and foreign direct investment. And the United States prevented Cuba from doing that with the dominant world capitalist economy by its blockade. Cuba's growth and development then was made possible by its integration into Comecon through trade and foreign investment. There are productivity gains from an international division of production, also called the division of labor, and Cuba's share of those, all the countries of Comecon benefited, though to different extents. Cuba's share was what allowed its impressive growth and development then, not Soviet subsidies. We can talk about this more in the Q&A if anyone wants to hang on to the Soviet subsidies myth, and I will illustrate the point with what's usually considered the Soviets' largest subsidy to Cuba, the price it paid for sugar. But in any case, if the blockade as it existed before Trump was imposed on Belgium or the Netherlands, not to talk of the 4 other countries that are not as developed, and not to talk of the vastly more severe Trump blockade, large amounts of their production would be stopped, and those countries would instantly economically implode. So, okay, back to Cuba, 1990 to 2019, and from that, Cuba going forward. We see from the solid line in this graph that Cuba has had to import roughly and with variations year to year about 11 billion pesos of goods to maintain its output and growth performance that it has had since the end of the world commodity boom in the noughts. When I say had to, I mean just what I talked about with production value change. Cuba's imports are in the first place not, quote, because it cannot produce anything and so it has to import whatever it consumes, but to the contrary, exactly because it needs to import goods to produce. In 2018, of its total imports of 11.5 billion pesos of goods that you see on the graph, 7.6 billion pesos were intermediate goods, that's 66%, while only 2.3 billion pesos were consumer goods, that's only 20%. And additionally, Cuba imported 1.6 billion pesos of capital goods. So this was additionally directed towards and necessary for production. That was an additional 14%. So added to the 16%, that's 80% of imports are for production. This is also discussed and sources given in my paper from the last month that I referred to already that you can get online or from myself or Cliff. If Cuba cannot import that much, that means Cuba's output will go down. And we will discuss in closing in 2020, as we'll discuss in closing in 2020, Cuba had to cut its imports by 40% in the first place because of the combination of the Trump major blockade and intensification, and in the second place because of the COVID crisis. And the result was exactly what we indicated. Output had to and did fall. The dotted line in this graph indicates what Cuba is able to earn from the export of goods. You see that Cuba cannot buy the imported goods it needs to operate its economy based on what goods like nickel and sugar and biotech goods and medical equipment it can export to other countries. In 2016 to 2018, we see it earned only a bit over 2 billion pesos from these. Cuba runs a deficit on its balance of trade in goods, and so it needs an additional source to earn 8 to 9 billion pesos equivalent in foreign currency to be able to buy that many imports needed for production. This and just one more slide. Here you see Cuba's solution. To keep the total balance of exports and imports on goods and service combined at about zero, as indicated by the central solid line, and given the negative balance on trade of 8 to 9 billion pesos that we just saw, as indicated by the small dashed line, which is in the negative low area of the graph, Cuba has to generate a positive balance of trade on services of the same amount. That's the upper line. And given that it imports very few services, this means it needs to generate services exports of about that same amount. In the 1990s, from almost nothing, in the face of the crisis, it developed its foreign tourist industry, most of the revenue from which is recorded as an export of a service, the service being tourism. In the 1990s, tourism was the engine of the entire economy, but by the early noughts, it shared that role first with nickel exports, whose value declined after the world commodity boom ended, but is still an important sector, and soon thereafter, also with its famous exports of medical services. So I'm also already going over time, so I'm going to end this section indicating the balance they had achieved in 2018, and then quickly close asking, what can Cuba do now? Because of the hyperactive US program to disrupt its international medical services, Cuba did not publish its earnings from them for 2 decades, though it was well known that they continually grew, and by the second decade of this century, it was a major source of export earnings. But in 2018, they did publish the earnings in their statistical reports. Here I will just read 6 sentences from my June paper, which also gives the data sources, indicating services' role in its trade balance and medical services' role in that. Quote, Cuba earned 14.5 billion pesos from exports of goods and services in 2018. Contrary to most third world countries, services dominated with 81.1% of the export earnings, while goods earned only 18.9%. By far, the largest single category at 6.4 billion pesos was the knowledge-based category, human health and social care services, much larger than the widely discussed tourism earnings at 3 billion pesos. Though much smaller, the non-traditional category of telecommunications and transmission and provision of services for information at 722 million pesos was just below the largest of Cuba's simple goods exports, ores, primarily nickel, and scrap metal at 776 million pesos. It was well above traditional export earners such as tobacco products at 260 million pesos and sugar products at only 180 million pesos. These figures again indicate some success in diversifying and in particular away from the stereotype of low value added primary products of third world countries. So recap, about 80% of Cuba's export earnings in 2018 were from services, with slightly over 50% of the service earnings being from medical services and just under 25% being from tourism. Last slide. 5 points in 1 minute, well, probably 2, which can be picked up and discussed in the discussion period. Okay, so this is today, the section 2, subtitle, Why the Collapse and How to Turn It Around. Okay, A, how big is the collapse? 20 in 2021 and 21. In 2020, the economy dropped almost 11%, 10.9%, and in addition, 2% in the first half of 2021. B, why the collapse? We've seen this. The primary 2 things that changed from the year before was the worldwide surge of COVID and the taking of effect of Trump's major strengthening the blockade. The result was drastically decreased export earnings, also secondarily an increase in import prices, but that's secondary. And from that, a necessary 40% reduction in exports, and we've seen why that reduced output. 40% reduction, yeah, right, in 40% reduction in imports, and we've seen why that reduced output. Okay, C, whose fault was the collapse? The Guardian just ran a piece. Cuban lefties begin to turn their fire on the harmful practices of the state that I'm guessing many of the people listening to this saw. Also, a number of people in Cuba who I consider dedicated revolutionaries have placed the majority of the blame for the situation of the Cuban economy today on the bureaucracy. As a longtime critic of bureaucratism as a poison to building socialism, I'm certainly sympathetic with criticizing anything the bureaucracy does wrong, especially if it's done bureaucratically. And it has indeed made many economic errors over the last 60 years, over the last 30 years, and over the process that started in 2006 when Raul became first acting and then official president. But despite identifying myself as an anti-bureaucratic socialist, I claim, and I claim my talk has given evidence to support, in this case, the primary cause for Cuba's recession is the combination of the intensified Trump blockade and COVID. Yes, we should correct whatever bureaucratic errors or deviations one can. That is important, but that is a secondary effect in this economic downturn. A perfect socialist collection of socialists sent from heaven would still have suffered an economic downturn in Cuba in 2020. And it would have been only marginally less than what happened concerning the fall in GDP that happened. D, would loosening the regulations on the private sector, as many forces advocate, help end the crisis. Loosening some restrictions on the private sector would likely result in the private sector being able to distribute the scarce goods in Cuba better, with better in quotes, I don't know if you saw those quotes, better in quotes, with the caveat that those with the most money in Cuba would get the most. But it could make almost no contribution to resolving Cuba's fundamental problem today, inadequate production of output because of a fall in export earnings and hence of imports and hence of production. Note that the private sector cannot produce output out of nothing. And the last section, what would be the 3 things that could contribute both most and fastest to ending the crisis, which, it must be noted, were actually what ended the implosion at the beginning of the 1990s. So we can understand from this presentation why the 3 really big things that would be most important and quick in turning around Cuba's situation are to increase exports, increase foreign direct investment, and restore remittances from the United States. Total remittances from the United States are only somewhat less than the total tourist earnings in 2018. all of which would return the purchasing power for productivity imports to what it was in 2018, exactly the things that had central responsibility for turning around Cuba's fall in 1993. And we see that the two main obstacles to Cuba doing this are the US intensified blockade, and beyond the blockade itself, the blockade itself, removing that, which would be a huge gain for Cuba's economy, and how the COVID pandemic unfolds. Okay, that's more than it. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Al. All right, a lot to digest there. Now we can turn to our viewers for your questions and comments. And those who are watching on YouTube, of course, don't have any direct way of asking questions. So what you need to do is send an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I'll pass your questions on to those in the Zoom room. Those who are in the Zoom room can ask your questions more directly. Since we have, 30 people in the Zoom room, more than I can see all at once on my screen, I will ask you to use the raise hand feature. If you're not familiar with that, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says reactions. And if you click on that, you can do some funny symbols, but don't use those. If you want to speak, click on the raise hand symbol. And I will then call on you so that you can unmute yourself and raise your questions or engage in dialogue. All right. So who would like to raise a question? We have some very well-informed people here, and I'm sure that there's a lot that you might want to say, or maybe even to dispute with what has been said. Okay, I see Michael Leibowitz visually raising his hand. Okay. Go ahead, Michael. Unmute yourself.
Okay. Well, just a few comments and then an extended one. I thought Al's discussion of the composition of the imports and the problem of the reasons for the decline in service income was excellent. I think it really puts the whole problem in context as in terms of the economic crisis. But I think we all have to recognize that in terms of the current situation, there's also a very serious social crisis, obviously relating to the economic crisis, but also more having deeper roots. I think that Mark's discussion of the Constitution and certain items in the Constitution was very good. I've never looked at that Constitution. On the other hand, there is the question of, is it in practice or is it just on paper? I mean, the classic example is the 1936 Constitution of the Soviet Union. So we have to ask, what is there in fact a movement in the direction of 21st century socialism? In fact, recognizing that one of the key characteristics of that is protagonism. Now, certainly Cuba has had these extended discussions of particular measures, and certainly none more than in the extended discussion of the lineamientos. when that discussion occurred, and I was there at the time, it brought in everybody, every community, every institution, et cetera, like people really contributing. But one of the things that was most striking in those discussions is the strong opposition to two of the propositions in the lineamento, one of which was the rapid phasing out of the libretta, which is the ration book, and the other being the rapid discarding of state employment. And in both cases, the effect, it was like the canary, the effect was the government pulled back on both of those issues. But the question I think we have to raise is, why was there that significant opposition? And I would suggest that in many ways it was a rejection of the discarding of the social contract that characterized the Cuban Revolution. Elements of that including, the libretta, the availability of so many goods, very cheaply, a general existence of subsidies for necessities, and the full employment focus. And those were, in fact, being challenged in the lineamentos. So the question is, when we look at those, to what extent, if we look at what that social contract initially was, it also included very clearly equality. So there was a recognition, and which was very important for the building of solidarity within Cuba, the existence of equality among all. Now, those are, I would suggest, the very things that we see disintegrating, that there is a decline in that social contract, and the government and the certainly objective circumstances in the last 20 years have been very significant. But on the other hand, there is the question of what is there to replace the social contract as it existed. Again, one of the characteristics of 21st century socialism, as was revealed, explicitly in Venezuela, was the emphasis on worker management and the emphasis on community democracy, especially as related to local communal councils and now the existence of the communes. So the question is, Cuba could have moved in that direction to increase democracy from below, but it is in fact moved in the opposite direction toward increasing inequality, toward increasing private sectors, et cetera. And one of the most interesting aspects of problems was they opened up the possibility of private employment and private businesses, I can't remember the word and the term again, but in fact have gone extremely slow in moving anything in the direction of cooperatives. They opened up private business, but didn't move first on cooperatives, and it's still extremely difficult to get cooperatives in the non-agricultural sector. So those are questions I really think should be addressed, is the general direction, because I think we all have to recognize that there is a real problem of ideological hegemony in relationship to young people, especially young people in the poorer areas at this particular point, who have been the most active in protesting, aside from the small group of basically counter-revolutionaries. So let me just quickly add that I may have to leave a little before the end because I have an exercise Zoom coming in at 1.
Al or Mark, either want to respond to this question of the rising inequality undermining the social contract and how cooperatives could have changed that?
So I have certainly things on all those things, and probably Mark does too, but I know I recognize the names of a heck of a lot of people that have a lot of thoughts both on Cuba and socialism in this discussion thing. I think we might at this point allow 4 or 5 people to throw out their thoughts. I do have answers to everything, but I think other people can answer each other in crosstalk and stuff like that.
Certainly.
That would be my suggestion.
That's a good suggestion. I'm just looking for other hands to be raised, and I don't see any yet.
I
My
see
hands have been
Eloise's
raised.
hand.
Okay. All right, Mark, you wanted to speak first?
No, I just was acknowledging that I had seen Eloise's hand go up about the
Okay.
same time that Michael's real hand went up.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah, I see it now. Go ahead, Eloise.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I was actually just going to add a very quick point on the cooperatives and what I saw happening with it, let's say in the 1990s. And Al, actually, I know knows some of these young economists too. I'm not an economist, but I did know young economists in Cuba, and they were just not convinced that private enterprise and allowing individual enrichment for individual effort wasn't a good idea. And so I think there was a pressure of that whole generation that might be behind the lack of a jump toward the cooperatives, although I do note that in the agricultural sector, but then he did mention that the UBPCs were quite successful. But what I actually wanted to talk about a little bit more, which was why I originally put up my hand, was just about the recent events. I am hoping I'll come back to this later after we've done more of this discussion. I was in Washington, D.C. yesterday and participated in what was, the two clashing demonstrations in Lafayette Park across from the White House. We can talk about that later, but I just wanted to mention that I was there at this point. That was short. That was it.
Okay. David Schwartzman has his hand up. Let me remind you all the way to raise your hand. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a reactions symbol to the right. And if you click on that, then you can go to raise hand. Okay, David, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. I came to this webinar a little late because I was on another one with Daniel Ellsberg on the whistleblowers. I was too at the demonstration yesterday in DC, and I put some things in the chat. I recently published an article about Cuba and degrowth. And it's interesting that leading degrowthists are pointing to Cuba as a model for basically the global South. That Cuba has a decent standard of living, it's doing well, and, its energy consumption, that's what the global South should aim for. But my critique is, obviously, Cuba is suffering from energy poverty, and it lowers their life expectancy. And even in spite of that, as I posted on the chat, I think Cuba may well have a higher life expectancy now than the United States, due to the high COVID death rate in the US compared to Cuba. And the CIA figures, if you want to look at the data on Wikipedia, look at the CIA data. The ranking of the US and Cuba as far as life expectancy is very close. Now, from before the COVID pandemic. So I think the recent data from the US that life expectancy went down by 1.5 years is telling in terms of Cuba's performance. And I want to thank Al, all of you, for really very informative presentations. And I think the life expectancy is a more robust measure of quality of life than the HDI, because that includes the GDP and so forth. And not only life expectancy, but the ability to live a healthy life for a long time. So I'm looking forward to the answers to Michael Leibowitz's point, which I found very, very interesting. Thank you.
All right, I'm looking for other hands. Who else wants to speak? Okay, Al? I thought you were raising yours.
Just fidgeting with my pen. If no one else wants to ask something, I'll start saying something, or Mark, if you want to jump in first, I don't care.
Go for it, Al.
Okay, all right. So I'll say a couple of things, then we'll return to stuff. So what I most strongly agree with Michael on, and from this all sorts of threads unfold, is that there's been a decline in the social contract in Cuba. I think that's really important. It's also been a change in the nature of the contract, and not necessarily all the changes are bad, but the overall, there's been a decline, and that's a fundamental problem because that's what socialism is about. Again, you start talking about the specifics. I am very much against things like the libretta, except for when they're necessary. Friends in Poland used to say that they subsidize all the goods, and that's what allows them to pay us low wages. And the logic of the endpoint of that thing is they completely subsidize the goods and pay us no wages, and that's what we call slavery. And I mean, so we can talk about that, but I actually think that, there's also talking about 20th century problems with the socialism. There became an identity between markets and capitalism. And I'm against market socialism, so I'm not going there. So don't worry, I'm not going to market socialism. but you've had markets in every single social formation that there's been. Markets, they're not just peripheral to feudalism and slave societies for luxury goods, as was generally pushed in the 20th centuries. They were at the center. Peasants had, not only the local fairs, but, even more local stuff than that. And they got cooking pots, and they got some equipment that they didn't make themselves, depending on if they were actually working on them. Anyway, so there was actually trade. You can go back to the slave society of Rome. They weren't all producing food. I mean, one of the biggest slave operations was mining, and they had to mine for gold because that was essential to the way the Roman Empire worked. And they traded the gold for the worked metal and stuff that they got the gold with. There was markets, but they weren't capitalist markets. Production was more like in the beginning of Marx's thing, petty commodity production, where things were exchanged, according to their labor time that was involved, et cetera, et cetera. So capitalism requires markets. I mean, it couldn't function without markets as we know capitalism, but it doesn't mean that markets imply capitalism. So I think markets can be an efficient mechanism. I mean, this is like Pat Devine, Michael. Pat's work, where Pat Devine separates between market forces and market mechanisms. But the fundamental question is, are they working as an exchange mechanism for efficiently exchanging a bunch of goods, or are they something which organizes production in order to produce surplus and produce and capture surplus value, and so forth and so on. So anyways, I'm against the libretta. What about the reduction of state employment? I won't go too far on that, but I will say right off that I was very much against, I wasn't at the time, but the 1967 revolutionary offensive in Cuba, where they nationalized everything down to the nails in their boots, as they said it. And so they took they'd already nationalized all the big stuff, and they nationalized all the little stuff. Now, I am open on the idea about it's a whole process. If they are capable of running everything without any private ownership of capital, that's fine. But you don't nationalize stuff when you don't know how to run it. And that was clear in Cuba, because they stopped providing those services for those people for the next 25 years. And they made no progress on learning how to do it. And so that's the issue on state employment. Anyways, but the bigger point is that the question of social contract, and the really big point of the things that he said about the questions of workers' control and the questions of community control. Now, there's some arguments that they're, and again, it's just like what Mark said. Mark pointed to some things, and they're also in the lineamientos of 2011, and the reproduction of those in 2016, and the reproduction of those in this year, in the spring. But how many of them are actually put in place? There is a shift out of planning in the central ministries to more local sort of stuff. And that's sort of good in and of itself, but that isn't the point. The point is it participative planning? And and I know from the huge discussion that they had in Venezuela about participation in planning and stuff like that. And that's the key question. And if you take some issues like the role of workers in their workplace, when the present Perfeccionamiento Empresarial began in the FAR, in the Revolutionary Armed Forces in the late 1880s, late 1980s, there was quite a bit of discussion about the role that the workers' councils had to play. And when the first documents came out in the early 1990s on that, there was also discussion, but a little bit less. And in the late 1990s, there was still less. And when Perfeccionamiento Empresarial ended with the lineamientos, when that whole thing was absorbed into a branch of the body that runs the entire economy, then there's been even less discussion. It's in there, but each time a little bit less. So, and that's really serious. I mean, that's the question of the social contract. And that's a question of some major things which you've written about, Marta's written about, Dario Anzelli's written about, that have come out of the Venezuelan revolution, which unfortunately only got going in the late aughts, and then Chavez died. Anyway, so the lack of that. Co-ops. Now, I'm very big on co-ops. I won't go on too much of that, but I was actually contracted, it should have come out by this fall, to write a book. All the chapters would have been written all on co-ops. They're written by Cuban authors, and we were going to translate it into English, myself and a co-author in Cuba on co-ops. And so, but it's now been postponed a year and a half, and maybe it'll be 2 years. So everybody's still enthusiastic. So if none of them die from COVID, I guess it'll come out. But anyway, that's a really fundamental thing. And there's lots of discussion, so I won't go into it right here. But they began an experiment. There was just a discussion on Cuba a little while ago, and Wendy Holmes spoke on that. And Cliff, you saw her comments on that, exactly that question. Why did they postpone it? And then there's a couple of reasons about they didn't want them to be bad co-ops, and they didn't want them to happen what happened in Venezuela, where 50% of the co-ops set up are fake co-ops and so forth and so on. But that doesn't really answer it. I mean, they launched the trial program in 2012, I think, and it was done by 2014. And they've promised to write a general co-op law every year since then. And as Michael said, it's much easier to launch yourself as a private businessman than it is to launch co-op. In fact, there's many, many effective co-ops down there that are made by everybody registering as a private businessman and then agreeing with each other that they're going to run themselves as co-ops. And so the question is why? And some people talk about ideological resistance in the central circles of the party, and it really isn't very clear. They keep committing themselves to saying, they say in the lineamientos, co-ops are a socialist form of property, okay? And private property. And incidentally, there's two types of private property. There's cuentapropistas, and there's the new things, the small and medium enterprises. And those are very, very different because one hires other people's labor and the other one doesn't. You cannot build capitalism on cuentapropistas, on self-employed people, because there is no production and capture of surplus value. You can't do it. Maybe it's good for socialism, maybe it's not. That's an open debate that has to be done. But you certainly can't build the capitalism on. But you sure can build it on small and medium, and then getting bigger and bigger enterprises. But that's private property, and that's a separate thing. But why didn't they get the same sort of production coming out of the co-ops, which has all sorts of reasons why it's not going to go the same direction as private property and the accumulation of capital. And that's something that people talk about. And yeah, okay, so that's co-ops. And then I'll just say a quick thing on energy scarcity, and then I'll stop because David brought that up. Cuba, like most every country, you want to get them to do something, and they'll probably get around to doing it if they have to and they don't have any choice, like organic agriculture, which, they've done a great job on. But, I was down there in the beginning of the 1990s interviewing the farmers, and they say, would you go back to the old way if you had oil to run your tractors again? They said, hell yes. In 2 seconds, I'd go back to that. Are you crazy? This is a lot more work. And so, but they do. They have the best, organic agricultural program in the world. So energy scarcity and stuff like that. Cuba it came damn close lots of times to having serious, significant oil hits off, especially the northwest coast of Cuba. But they never quite came in, and so that never. And so Cuba is invested in solar and industry. For example, I'll just give one example and then I'll stop. It's very interesting. They're not the world leader on it. They're not shaking things up, but there's interesting stuff going on. They've taken Granma province and made that a center for solar research. Mark's an expert in Granma. He normally has a background screen that says University of Granma on it and stuff like that, but he can't get access to it today. They had a very fascinating project that was set up as a joint venture. So this is the sort of foreign capital that actually does good. So it's set up with a British company that's actually invested in a number of solar things, but they did this large one, which opened in 2020. And it's a power plant in Ciego de Avila, and it provides 50% of the 50% of, the article said 50% of the energy needs of the province. I don't know if they really meant energy needs or whether they meant 50% of the electricity energy needs, which is a very different number. But in any case, it's big. And what they do, it's very, and they do pump a lot of energy back into the national net. But what they do is they burn sugarcane bagasse during the harvest season, and that's not surprising. But what they also do is for the off season, which is half the year, they now go out and they take all the marabou off of about 10,000 acres of land every year, returning fertile land to farming ability, because Cuba lost, I don't know what the figure is, 15, 20% of its fertile land during the special period because it became overgrown with marabou. And marabou is, you can't get through it. It's anyway. So yeah. Okay, so they do recognize that, and their movement on it is good. But you have to go back to like the readings of Richard Levins or something like that, and talking about, Cuba doesn't always move the way that it should, but it's very important to keep in mind that it doesn't have the incentives not to move that way. When they don't move the right way, it's because they're bungling and stupid. It's not because they have a system which tells them that they ought to be doing things against the interests of people.
Okay, I want to welcome into the discussion Victor Wallace and Patty Quick, both of whom had their hands up. But before that, Mark, I thought you were sort of next if you had anything that you wanted to respond to first.
Yeah, I'll make some brief comments and then pick up the discussion if others, based on others' questions as well. Michael is absolutely right in terms of the paper I worked on. It focuses much more on what the Constitution indicates that the society and those who supported it aspire to. I do think, though, there is some evidence that there has been increased participation in workplaces and at the local level. It's very clear, though, that engaging people more in a participatory, participative, even protagonist economy doesn't necessarily translate into everybody being happy with the decisions that get made. I mean, I don't know if we're in a position to identify, where the average person, if you will, wanted things to go with regard to the libretta and state employment. I mean, certainly my friends and colleagues would tend to be critical of the retraction in what I think is appropriately identified as a social contract. And in some ways, given my emphasis on education and education policy, there's a lot of rumblings among colleagues about how what at one point was an expansion of higher education suddenly got cut back with the moves during the post-Raul Castro ascension to power, and even more recently haven't been resumed. I think one of the big questions for me is, given that the Constitution was approved and begun to be implemented in the first part of 2019, and then the efforts within both local but all the way up to the National Assembly of People's Power to begin developing legal mechanisms for the implementation of some of these. And then the pandemic hit. And then Trump began to wave his big stick, if you will. There has been some progress on developing laws from what I've been able to track, but exactly how they're being implemented. But the big question is, and I know a lot of people are concerned that what they came to expect as a Cuban from the society, from the state, is not being delivered. But of course, many people, I think, appropriately, and Al's analysis, I think, reinforces the appropriateness of it, see the problem in small part because of the nature of the Cuban government and the Communist Party's role, but mainly in terms of the embargo and the huge impact that the pandemic had. And despite that, if you look, I mean, I don't know how you identify the level of distress and anger and protest for or against the government, other than the number of people who show up in the streets. I mean, it's very clear that the important and notable counter-government protests that took place, which, by the way, weren't fully instigated within Cuba, to put it mildly, were overwhelmed by the numbers of people who went out in the street after President Diaz-Canel encouraged them to do so. So there are a lot of people who aren't happy, but that doesn't mean that they want to overthrow the current revolutionary government. I just want to make a brief comment on David Schwartzman's point about life expectancy. I think you're right. That's an important indicator for those of us who are doing societal studies, but it doesn't resonate very well to the average person on a day-to-day basis. If you're alive, if you may have a sense of life expectancy in terms of your relatives, but there are other things, like hunger, and access to medicine. I mean, Cliff led off this webinar with a call for donations to the medical campaign that I was a part of a group that helped to launch the Saving Lives campaign. Actually, the Canadians kind of stimulated us to move in this direction. But why does a healthcare system that has been celebrated and acknowledged internationally need basic medicines? And why can't this incredible pharmaceutical biopharma industry produce the medications? You've got to be able to import some of the basic ingredients. I mean, Al made the comment more generally, but in terms of the biopharma industry, if you don't have all the ingredients internal to the nation, you have to rely on importing them. And importing them is not only difficult because the embargo restricts you in who you can import from, but you also have to have generated the financial resources to be able to purchase them from places that you can. Let me leave it at that, and we'll come back later.
Okay, since Mark just mentioned the medical aid to Cuba campaign, for the benefit of those who came in late and maybe did not see the earlier announcement, let me just interject that here for a moment. The Center for Global Justice is launching a campaign to raise funds to send medical aid, both medicines and syringes to Cuba. So you're invited, urged, in fact, to contribute, to make donations, which are tax deductible. And we will see that they get to Cuba, and the Cuban people would be very appreciative. Okay, let me turn the floor back now to Victor Wallace, and following that, Patty Quick. And if there's anyone else who wants to say anything, you can raise your hands and I'll put you in the stack. Victor.
Just a very brief comment. This is an excellent discussion. I've learned a lot, and I must say I'm somewhat more optimistic than I was before. And I guess that I see the issue, mainly the question is a subjective one, which has been addressed partly, the attitudes of the people, and apparently that the younger people have less confidence in what the revolution can accomplish than their elders. And I just wonder, from the first-hand experience of either of you, what you can tell us about the process of enlightenment as it may affect these younger people and bring them to understand the real cause of their problems. Thank you.
I think Patty has what she wants to say relates to that point. So let me call on you next.
Mute.
Yeah, you unmuted yourself momentarily.
There you go.
There you go.
No.
You just click once there. We still can't
muted,
hear you.
Patty.
Okay,
There.
just a couple of things. I really appreciate Al's recognition that GDP has its limitations, and that the concept of household production, small commodity production, and cooperative production are not in themselves exploitative. But I want to take that a little step further to argue that the protests that we're seeing from young people are just pissed off, and who can blame them? Life's shitty, it's not their fault, but we need to recognize what young people are doing with their time and the role that young people are playing in the development of culture. And rather than see all youth activity as anti-government, to recognize it's a form of assertion of their rights to participate in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whatever you want to call it. So the GDP has its real limitations in an understanding of what is going on and how people are reacting to it. So if we're really talking about young people's participation in the revolution, we need to recognize that their activity does not consist solely of their participation in commoditized, monetized production, but in the whole of their lives that they carry. That's all.
Good to see you again, Patty. We went to Cuba together many, many years ago. Haven't seen you since. Let me just make an observation about this question of the younger generation. The special period of the 1990s, basically a decade of depression, was experienced by people who had lived through the golden age of the 1980s. They knew how good socialism could be, and that's helped to sustain their hope. Today, anyone who is under age 30, that is born since 1990, the start of the special period, has only known that hardship, the scarcities. And so it's not surprising that they don't have that reservoir of confidence in what the future might hold for them as things get better, as socialism is able to recover from the present period. And so it's not surprising that there would be, dissatisfaction among that younger generation. The challenge is to somehow or another restore a sense of hope there. But I see that Norma Harrison has raised her hand. So let me call on you next for your comment or question, and then we'll go to our two main speakers to respond to points that have been raised. Unmute yourself, Norma.
That'll work.
Good.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be on this show. It's so good. Socialism is that the people take ownership out of the hands of their owners and provide it to them all under a structure that is not about ownership, but control, and control production so that it is for themselves, for them all, and by them all, regardless of age and all the other restrictions that they say, oh, you can't work here because you're not the right age, or they're not the right size, or not the right whatever they exclude people by. Everybody is included in what would be called the workforce in a capitalist society, but in a socialist society, it's just the people making the things that we need and like for and by each other. The idea of us having to sit here where we have enough food and so forth, and I don't think we have a lot of hope, though. I think we have a lot of fear and recognize our loss here in the capitalist construct. So I think we don't have, I think the majority of people don't have a hope of what to do about it. I always do, because I believe in socialism, the socialist struggle. I see that Fidel laid a foundation of understanding of what people are about in this struggle. And people have been committed to it in Cuba for 50, 60 years, growing in ability to understand what that struggle is, because he was so educative and so commanding of their interest and allegiance to themselves, as well as to the process. So us misinterpreting what socialism is and saying, well, they haven't achieved socialism, they're not working for socialism. You know that in China, the people, the billionaires do not run the government, right? So we're talking about having an effort to try to have the communist revolution survive. And that's at all costs. People forget that, when they say Stalinist and so forth, which Stalin says there's no ist, said there's no ist to Stalin, you like what I do, but I'm not propounding a Stalinist doctrine. Stalin was committed to the survival of the revolution. And that's what all that problem was about. And the contradictions that become evident and that we're talking about and seeing, those occur in the struggle. How do you do this? This thing that has been worked against for millennia, for thousands of years. Another structure has invaded our minds, and the opposition to it has not been allowed to rise. People who put it forward are persecuted tremendously, as you know, locked in dungeons and other ways of horrifying people who strive to advance a mutualistic society. They've been assaulted constantly. People have risen up for forever. I'm convinced people could have created a communist structure to their society 500 years ago, but they weren't allowed to by the profiteers and their physical assistance in maintaining their own ownership. So that it has advanced to this stage is that it is socialism, and that it has problems is part of the effort to have it survive in the face of the onslaught against it.
There is a question that has come in from the YouTube viewers. Let me just read that out to you. Al's explanation for today's economic problems makes sense to me. This comes from Tiffany Montoya. But I also understand that Cuban citizens are thoroughly educated about the revolution, its history, and socialism in school. This would make me think that the Cuban people would be able to see that the blockade would be to blame. So where do you think the ideological counter-revolutionary pushback is coming from? Is there a propaganda issue? Okay, well, we have several questions on the floor now. Who would like to respond to any of them?
Mark should definitely go first.
I'll go first here. I think the focus on younger people is appropriate and certainly one of the big challenges that Cubans face. But it's not only, well, depends how you define youth, I guess, up to age 30 or more, or 50. Some of us like to think about when we were, but Cuba has historically faced a problem, not just in the special period, but prior to that. I mean, even if you think about Che's intervention in the 60s was in part of a project that to encourage people to develop different values, to conceive of themselves as part of a socialist project as opposed to a more individualist one. And that's occurred at various points in time, including in the last 2 decades. The education system has had to focus. I mean, yes, if you look at the curriculum of schools and universities, there's a message, but students are not always paying attention, although perhaps Cuban students pay more attention, but more importantly, they're getting access increasingly to other sources of information. Social media has opened up and is being used by government authorities and some of the mass organizations, but it's also being used by opposition, including what we witnessed on the 11th of this month, kind of bot instigated mass social media broadcasts. So there is this alternative voice that people get access to, and of course, if the situation, if the social contract, if the inequalities, etc., in people's lived experience make it more challenging, one might be more open to some of these messages. I mean, even people who think that, and including leaders of the government who think that there have been mistakes made, would put more emphasis on the embargo. But there are a number of Cubans who have heard the embargo for over 60 years as the explanation of their problems, and are wondering whether this is just an old saw as opposed to an important continuing challenge to Cuban society. I find it really interesting that the struggles that have gone on within some of the universities. Interesting in the sense that it challenges, a sector of youth. Obviously, not all Cubans immediately go into higher education, but in 2015-16, I think it was, the higher education laws were reformed to require that all students, in order to graduate, have to pass English. Maybe a great idea, but the Cuban higher education system was not really ramped up to provide the English support or English classes that were needed, in order for some people to learn enough to be able to pass that test. School English instruction was relatively effective, but again, the test had a higher order. So what happened? There was a rise of private tutoring, which to me, fits into the private sector. And for the most part, these have been individual private tutors, but there are also groups that have, in a way, formed cooperatives, but not been approved to be cooperatives in kind of organizing the provision of English instruction. So there's kind of a shadow networks of tutors who are working together, some of whom are actually involved in arrangements. I've explored this in Havana with students at the pedagogical university, who some of whom are involved in teaching English, tutoring English, but they actually are part of what might be looked at as companies, because they end up having to give a certain portion of the fees they receive from individual students to the coordinator of it. So you have a government policy which wasn't followed by provision of sufficient resources for the higher education system to conduct this, spurring the growth of individual tutors, and then it becomes much more organized than that. And I can tell you, among the people who provide tutoring, they find the restrictions on their private enterprise to be a concern, while at the same time, they also recognize that they are part of a society that is had provided them with education to start with. And so it's kind of a tension that they achieve. And I think, you know, the limited number of Cubans I've personally got to know and talk to experience these kinds of tensions. You know, if they were in charge personally of what was produced and the kinds of consumer products that were available, they might want certain ones, but their neighbor might want others. And how does that get worked out? I think it begins to get worked out in the planning that takes place in these local organizations. The one thing I didn't mention, and I'll end here, is that in addition to the workplace planning activities, there's an effort to bring the local community into those discussions, because if workers ignore the impact it has on the local community, either environmentally or in terms of what it is that the local community would want, you could produce things that make more sense to the workers and less so to the consumers. And this kind of combination, again, I don't think Cuba does it perfectly, but you know, I'd be interested to know where it gets worked out. And I certainly don't think that market forces are the way that gets done, particularly in other than a ideal type society where you know, individuals actually control what is produced and at what cost it's available.
Well, we're at having completed 2 hours. So let me give the floor to Al to sum up, and then we will need to end.
Okay, 5 minutes. Would that be too much or?
Good.
Okay, so 3 points. Lots more to say,
No,
obviously.
5 minutes, that's fine.
But 3 points. I actually wanted to highlight just something which is in the chat thing, the very first entry in it. David Schwartzman put it in. People should just look at it. I'm not going to talk about it. But Cuba's relation to eco-socialism and what they're doing in that way. They have a bunch of fascinating independent institutions down there that work with the government and everything. And again, the work, the writings that Richard Levins did on ecological stuff that Cuba did over decades, and the socialist, and why it was able to happen in the way it did, different than it could have happened in a capitalist country, is very, very fascinating. That's all I'm saying that, but people should think about that. And actually, David knows vastly more about it than I do, and talk to him about it. The second thing is the youth, and I won't say too much because there's 5 minutes, but you know, people brought up the same thing. Both Victor and Tiffany, you know, brought up, you know, the process of enlightenment for the young people. The young people are being taught this in the schools, and yet they don't seem to be absorbing it. Why is that? Well, I mean, lots of reasons. First of all, you have to experience something and not just be taught it. Second of all, you go out and you look for information, and you know, people have, you know, even for these demonstrations which exploded in Cuba, people have documented the total wave of false information, which the United States is now set up to create massively for not just Cuba, but for Bolivia and Peru and whatever other country it wants to do. And so this is all now, you know, tracked and documented and stuff like that. So, you know, a young person is trying to figure out what to believe. We know young people in the United States can't figure out what to believe. And so why are we surprised that, you know, people in Cuba faced with the deepest crisis that beyond the lifetime of most of the people there. Why are we not surprised that they're picking up on a bunch of stuff? But those are the fundamental questions. Why aren't they? What could be done to? And the question is all about the youth, which I'm not going to go into saying any more on because people did. I wanted to end by just jumping back to what Michael said, and Michael's gone now, but that is the question. The old social contract is half there, but half not there. And the question is, what will the new social contract be that's going to replace? That's the fundamental thing that has to be determined in Cuba right now. And I said I was anti-bureaucratic. Here's something which really bothers me. In the 2011 lineamientos, the statement of this social political direction that Cuba's going, they had a huge, massive national discussion and debate, 9/10 of the population before it was adopted in workplaces, in communities. It was really, really impressive, something which, nothing in the United States ever happens anything like it. In 2016, when they redid them, they had a very impressive discussion after the fact, okay? And it made a big difference but it's pretty clear if you read the history that the bureaucracy did not intend to repeat the discussion that they had in 2011. And there was such a social upcry that they then had a year of social discussion, and they actually changed the document significantly as a result of it. So that's the two sides of the story. There's a bureaucracy that's operating one way, but it's not so set and determined that it can't respond to popular pressure. And it does. And we saw that in 2016. And it was very impressive. And so, I mean, that's really important about what the bureaucracy can and can't do. Now, in the 2021 one, they did away with discussion altogether, fundamentally. Now they had COVID as a cover, and so they couldn't have all the meetings in the workplaces, et cetera, et cetera. What does that mean for what will happen next? So all I want to say is there's a fight going on. I mean, it's a fight everywhere for socialism, but there's a fight going on for socialism in Cuba today. That's the thing to keep in mind. It's not like, oh, we can trust Fidel and we're going to have socialism. No, I mean, the Cuban people are going to have to fight for socialism, and they are fighting for it. And for anyone who goes down there and talks with people everywhere, you see how these ideas permeate average masses and intellectuals and everybody else, and it's damn exciting. But it is a fight, and it's not determined. It's not determined which way it's going to go. It's the fight for socialism that's going on everywhere else in the world as well.
Well, with that, we must end. I want to give great thanks to Al and to Mark for a very stimulating discussion, and all of the rest of you who participated in it as well. Today's webinar, as well as all of our past programs, are available on YouTube, which are accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. And I want, before we leave you, to remind you again of the campaign to send medical aid to Cuba. Please donate to that. Go to our website at globaljusticecenter.org, and you can donate, make your tax-deductible donations from there. Next Monday, we have a special program where we will be participating in the revisiting of the racism in U.S. history. We'll be looking at the Wilmington, North Carolina massacre and coup d'etat that occurred in 1898 that ended a biracial fusion government in North Carolina's largest city, and turned the government and the state into the hands of white supremacists, who then consolidated Jim Crow. There is a film that has been made by people who have researched that little-known historical episode in Wilmington, and we will be showing that film next Monday. And let me also call to your attention, the following Monday is the anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And our webinar will focus on that with a talk by Gar Alperovitz, who has written the definitive study of the decision to drop the bomb. So hope you will join us then in these next upcoming webinars. Let me give thanks to our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamant, Olivia Canales, and yours truly, Cliff Duran. And that is me signing off now for today. Thank you.